Thank you. Good afternoon for spending your time here with us this week, Friday afternoon, and Dylan Moore, Associate Professor here at the Public Policy and Global Affairs. We are delighted to have the third and final installment of a series of talk given by Mr. Hari Kausikan on the challenges of Singapore's foreign policy. Mr. Kausikan needs no introduction. He is the policy and politics. He was the former permanent secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and served as ambassador to the Russian Federation. He was also the former chairman of the Middle East Institute, where he remains as distinguished fellow. So in the first couple of lectures, Mr. Kausikan talked about the fundamentals of Singapore's foreign policy, history of Singapore foreign policy, and some of the principles that still remain relevant today. Mr. Kausikan also talked about identity and how internal coherency is important and vital for foreign policy as well, and the need for nation building in the Singapore case is still ever present. And the demands, in fact, active nation building efforts as well. In this final lecture, Mr. Kausikan will walk us through some of the challenges facing Singapore's foreign policy, and I'm sure there's lots of ground to cover, and I invite you and welcome you to ask questions as well. No questions too difficult for Mr. Kausikan, so please make use of that time. Without further delay, Mr. Kausikan, please, the stage is yours.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me back again. This is the third and final lecture that Professor said. And to all of you who have been hardy enough or curious enough or kind enough to have endured all or some of these lectures, thank you very much. My approach in the first two lectures and this one too has been conceptual, because I don't think the way we approach many specific external issues, US-China relations or relations with our neighbors, or attitudes towards ASEAN, or attitudes towards the UN, or actually any specific issue. I don't think it really can be appreciated without a grasp of the basic ideas that underpin our approach. Actually, this is not the first time I've talked to a university on Singapore's foreign policy. In 2029, I think I gave 5 lectures on Singapore's foreign policy to NUS. You remember there is a place called NUS. That mainly focused on such specific issues, just as I mentioned a moment ago. But I did not give sufficient emphasis to the underlying concept. And for that reason, I have increasingly found those NUS lectures unsatisfactory. So I must thank NTU for giving me the opportunity to correct my earlier error. I trust that those of you who have followed the first 2 lectures, I trust that I have now cast some light on some concepts that underpin our foreign policy that, at least in my opinion, are insufficiently understood or insufficiently stressed in the public discourse on our foreign policy. Let me just give a quick summary of the first 2 lectures. The first lecture stressed that the strategic imperative of a small country, a city-state, is to create relevance for itself. Relevance is a relational and dynamic concept. And keeping ourselves relevant is always a work in progress, always a state of becoming and never of being. Because what makes us relevant must be continually redefined as circumstances change. To think of Singapore's relevance as a static state, or to believe that there can be a definitive state of relevance, a definitive definition of how we make ourselves relevant for all time, is to risk becoming irrelevant. In fact, it's not just a risk. I think we will become irrelevant if we have that feeling. The second lecture stressed identity. How we regard ourselves and how we want others to think of us is our core national interest, encompassing our most essential and vital values. This sense of self is the lodestar that enables us to keep our bearings as we navigate unpredictable international events that are always in flux and in recent years are changing at an accelerating rate. driven not just by the policies of major powers, but more fundamentally driven by technology. Now, if we lose sight of who we are, if we forget what sets us apart from other countries and are not prepared to defend our uniqueness, we will be at grievous risk of being torn apart by powerful external centrifugal forces. So those are the two concepts, relevance and identity. And the thread linking relevance with identity is agency. The processes by which we choose to exercise our agency to keep ourselves relevant and define and defend our identity is always political. And our political choices in foreign policy must be informed by the distinction between what Mr. S. Rajaratnam, our first foreign minister, called the theology of foreign policy and practical diplomacy. He made a distinction between these two. He argued that every country needs both theology and practical diplomacy, but to confuse them would be suicidal. Now, one of the reasons I committed to give these 3 lectures is because I think there is some danger of such confusion between theology and practical diplomacy taking hold in Singapore. Not just among the general public, but even in some quarters of our public service. Now, I don't think matters have yet reached a stage where this is irreversible, but the symptoms are clearly discernible. The most egregious risks are already being dealt with, but public understanding of the challenge of the distinction between theology and practical diplomacy is still, to my mind, shallow, and this creates vulnerabilities. Now, the Singapore government spends more time than many other governments explaining foreign policy to the public. But it is in the nature of governments, all governments, anywhere, to emphasize the theology of foreign policy more than the realities of practical diplomacy. Our government cannot be as frank as it may like about foreign policy, because to be frank is to risk arousing adverse reactions from other governments. The compromise, kind of halfway house between confining ourselves to theological platitudes and being brutally frank about harsh realities, is what we call national education. However, and it's a big however, the unfortunate fact is that we don't do national education very well, at least in my opinion. And this is despite, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say, because of the existence of a large and elaborate bureaucratic machinery devoted to national education in the Singapore government. How we do national education is generally rather formalistic, indeed ritualistic, and may do as much harm as good because it often arouses cynical responses. The institutions primarily involved, the Ministries of Defence and Education, tend to get extremely defensive when this is pointed out, and I pointed out to them, and it's only not me who did it, and often refer to surveys that purport to show that national education is working. There are many surveys. I hope my former colleagues in the civil service, in these 2 ministries in particular, will forgive me for saying that Singaporeans are not stupid and know the politically correct answers to surveys. So I have grave doubts about the accuracy of these surveys. Now, I understand that my former colleagues are doing as best as they can, and I was once in their position and I sympathize with them. But what can we do about this? Apart from better talking points, and over time all talking points tend to degrade into ritual phrases, and apart from doing better talking points and increasing the depth of understanding of those whose duty is to deliver the talking points, because a great weakness is who to teach the teachers, particularly at in the secondary, the primary, secondary, junior college level. Apart from teaching the teachers better and having better talking points, the best national education is provided by events. It was Dr. Mahathir's constant threat to potong, cut water, that played a key role in getting Singaporeans to accept new water, recycle wastewater, and drove home the complications of our relationship with our closest neighbor. And it was Beijing's seizure of our armored personnel carriers that gave Singaporeans a much more nuanced understanding of the complexities that are concealed when we refer to the People's Republic as a friend. However, I think the effect of both episodes has probably worn off. Memories are short, and at any point of time, the understanding of most people is probably dominated by what our government must say about the theology of our relations with Malaysia and China. Theology is at best only a partial representation of the realities of these relationships, as well as other international issues. What we need, as I said, apart from better talking points and a better way of educating the educators, is a system to take timely and systematic advantage of such real-life incidents when they occur. And unfortunately, for better or worse, they will occur regularly. But I want to focus this afternoon on concepts, not policies. So suffice it to say, I have reason to believe, I know in fact, that national education and the limitations of our current approach are now recognized as a national security concern at senior levels of our government, and I expect that our approach will be revisited. I reserve judgment on what will emerge from this process. I want to talk today about what, at the conceptual level, is the essential challenge. And that is our history, Singapore's history, our understanding of our history, and the uses and abuses to which that understanding may be put. Singapore is not just a spatially defined place. It is also, and more essentially, an idea. The idea of Singapore is a product of our history. In my second lecture, I had referred to our unique identity, our core national interests, emerging out of the post-World War II political struggles that entangled decolonization with Cold War anti-communist dynamics, and both with battles against Chinese and Malay chauvinisms. These complex processes led to merger to form Malaysia, but ultimately made remaining within Malaysia unviable and led to separation. And this is the conventional framing of Singapore's history, modern Singapore's history, I should say. Now, before there can be decolonization, there has to be colonization, of course. And the conventional framing of Singapore's history is itself part of a slightly broader frame that dates modern Singapore's history from 1819. The most example of this conventional narrative is the first volume of Lee Kuan Yew's. The most important example is the first volume of Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs entitled The Singapore Story. The most extreme version of this conventional Singapore story is perhaps the curt and uncompromising appraisal of the former Raffles Professor of History at the University of Singapore, the predecessor of NUS, Professor K.G. Tregoning, who in 1969, only 4 years after separation, said, "Modern Singapore began in 1890. Nothing that occurred on the island prior to this has particular relevance to an understanding of the contemporary scene. It is of antiquarian interest only." End of quote. Now, what is conventional is not necessarily wrong. Of course, Singapore did not spring forth fully formed in 1819 or 1965. And thanks to the work of the late Professor John Missick and many others, too many to individually name, we now know that archaeological and other evidence traces Singapore in its earliest known iteration as Temasek, as one of several Southeast Asian port cities 700 years back to the 14th century. But the same evidence, archaeological and other evidence, also shows that for reasons that are still not entirely clear, it declined and for all practical purposes had disappeared from history by the 17th century, only gradually reappearing with diminished status in the course of the 18th century until Sir Thomas Stamford Raffles and William Farquhar and William Farquhar deserves at least as much credit as Raffles for modern Singapore, brought us back into prominence in the 19th century, laying the foundations of our post-1965 development. Professor Tregoning's harsh judgment that everything that occurred prior to 1819 was only of antiquarian interest is a gross exaggeration, but not one that can be entirely dismissed. Now, this is not a lecture on Singapore's pre-modern history, but on foreign policy. There are now many excellent works that those interested in Singapore's past, please note the plural, can consult. My concern is only with those parts of our history that are directly pertinent to the emergence of our core national interests, the values of multiracialism and meritocracy, as the bedrock of our uniqueness and hence of our relevance and survival. From this point of view, a national educational perspective, if you like, the issue is really how to frame our 1819 and post-1965 history in a way that acknowledges our pre-colonial past without losing focus on the circumstances that led to the emergence of our core national interests, while also avoiding the parallel errors of either entirely ignoring the pre-colonial past or succumbing to what may be called, at least I call it, the wokeist fallacy, now fashionable among the more superficial type of academics across the world who propagate it to their students. And the wokeist fallacy is belittling or denying the colonial roots of our present. That's not unique to Singapore. It's everywhere in the world. And it's, to my mind, very stupid because you don't, the modern Singapore, modern Malaysia, modern America, modern anything does not spring out of nowhere. There is a past, and not all the past is pleasant. Now, the importance of this task, reframing, taking into account those considerations, not losing sight of how the core values emerge and avoiding the twin errors of just ignoring what happened before or belittling it. The importance of this task cannot be underestimated. Youth have taken to the streets or expressed their discontent with the status quo through the ballot box or other means in Bangladesh, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Chile, Colombia, and Peru, among other countries. I could easily extend that list. Now, there are specific socio-economic reasons for the dissatisfaction of young people in these countries that do not apply to Singapore. But the restlessness of the global young is something to be more across the world, in all types of political systems, young people have, to use the words of the French political scientist Olivier Roy, a professor at the European University Institute in Florence, and I quote him, become detached from the cultural references of their elders. At the same time, Wu Jilin, professor of history at East China Normal University, has recently written of Chinese students that, and I quote him now, those born in the 1990s and 2000s no longer believe in great narratives, end of quote. The two observers from such different backgrounds have arrived at much the same conclusions should alert us that there is no a priori reason to believe that Singapore will somehow be forever exempt from what appears to be a global phenomenon. There is an urgent need to refresh our national narrative for new generations that have only known a prosperous Singapore, to whom the events of the 1960s seem antiquarian, to borrow Professor Tregoning's dismissive epithet, or perhaps Jurassic may be a better description of their attitudes towards these stories. They have heard that dinosaurs once existed, seen their fossils in museums, but what have dinosaurs got to do with my life? That's the attitude. The stories of our innate vulnerability, the hard-fought struggles with the Communist United Front and against Chinese and Malay chauvinists, the racial riots of the 1960s, and the fragility of the social cohesion that is now taken for granted, if indeed anybody pays attention to them, are received with skepticism as partisan tropes intended to keep the PAP in power and not the core of the national story from which emerged what S. Rajaratnam called our essential values. Now, to be honest, I'm not sure that a reframed narrative of Singapore's history will necessarily gain greater traction with the new generation of Singaporeans. But I am certain that not attempting refreshing the Singapore story risks jeopardizing what makes Singapore Singapore. So we must try. Any attempt at reframing the Singapore story must acknowledge inherent tensions that must be managed. The primary tension is between the imperative of preserving the uniqueness of how we have chosen to organize ourselves nationally as a secular sovereign state in the midst of the Malay-Muslim Southeast Asia, whose majority population, our majority population, is of Chinese ethnicity, but nevertheless insists on multiracialism and has adopted English as the lingua franca. That's a very unique thing that we are in Southeast Asia. We must reconcile that with what we now know of our past as one of several port cities in the Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim worlds of Majapahit, Srivijaya and the Johor Riau Lingga Kingdom, as well as the current reality of our location at the locus of US-China strategic competition. Modern Singapore is an anomaly, and we must always be an outlier in Southeast Asia. A small country cannot be ordinary. It can't be just like any other country in your region. To be relevant, it has to be extraordinary. So that's the first tension that has to be managed. And an overlapping tension is between nation building, and don't forget Singapore is only 60 years old, and nation building is still a work in progress, and perhaps will always be a work in progress, between nation building and the no less crucial economic imperative of keeping open to and integrated with global networks. The idea of Singapore will lack credibility if it is not also demonstrable as a materially superior way to organize our society. If not carefully managed, there are potential conflicts of identity between the imperatives of nation building and the imperatives of economic success that risk diluting the focus on our core national interests. I don't think most of the audience will remember, but it was not too long ago that a senior member of the Singapore establishment, a former ambassador who is also a former non-constituency member of parliament and also former attorney general, or it's all one person, these many formers, caused something of a stir by describing himself as a cosmopolitan, not a Singaporean. That controversy was a storm in a teapot. It's trigger in itself. It was a storm in a teapot, but it did point to the potentially divisive contradictions between the local and the global. Emphasizing regionalism is one means of managing the tensions. ASEAN and its institutions such as the EAS, East Asia Summit, the ADMM Plus and the RCEP connect the local with the regional and the global. Now, to provide such connections is of course not ASEAN's only or even primary function, but that it does serve such functions is a useful reminder that ASEAN, notwithstanding the charter adopted in 2007, which gave it a legal personality, is not an autonomous reality. ASEAN is only an instrument of its members' foreign policy, and it will not always be the most appropriate instrument for dealing with every issue we face. Regional solutions to regional problems is sometimes only a cover for the imposition of the will of the largest country in the region. Small countries should therefore always closely and critically examine regional solutions and never just reach for them as a kind of Pavlovian reflex. Unfortunately, however, ASEAN, as well as the ideas on which regionalism is based, international law and international organization, are also the most often and most insistently the subjects of theological pronouncements, perhaps second only to the idea that diplomacy is about being friendly rather than about pursuing interests. This not only gives Singaporeans a distorted view of regional and international relations, contributing to what I call foreign policy illiteracy in my first lecture, but also risks our own rhetoric clouding our judgments. Indeed, the more eloquent the rhetoric, the greater the risk of believing our own propaganda. That was at least a contributing factor to the miscalculations we made on Myanmar I mentioned in an earlier lecture. Reframing the Singapore story while managing these potential tensions is an inescapably political enterprise. Please don't misunderstand me. I am confident that the vast majority of the historians, whether Singaporean or foreigners, who have worked hard to expand our understanding of Singapore's history, have no other agenda than the advancement of knowledge. And all Singaporeans should be grateful to them. But, unfortunately, not all historians have good intentions. And let me give you one example from my own history. In October 2015, a few months after Mr. Lee Kuan Yew died, Fitzwilliam College in Cambridge University, where he had received his law degree, held a half-day commemorative conference entitled The Legacy of Lee Kuan Yew and the Future of Singapore. As I recall, 3 Singaporeans were invited to speak. Our High Commissioner, of course, myself, and Dr. P.J. Tan, a historian, or at any rate, the holder of a PhD in history, which is not necessarily the same thing as being a historian. The other speakers were foreigners, mainly academics with connections to Singapore. Of the Singaporeans, Dr. Tam spoke first. I don't remember all the details of what he said, but it was essentially a rant that gave the impression that nothing that happened in Singapore after 1965 was of any consequence except Lee Kuan Yew suppressing freedom of speech. Suppression of freedom of speech in Singapore was Dr. Tam's main theme. Now, I fully accept that there is never a last word in history, and history is subject to constant revision as new facts come to light. But that is the point. Readers have to have a factual basis. I can accept that as the price of holding Singapore together, the exercise of certain freedoms has had to be qualified. I can even accept that perhaps on occasion they were overly curtailed. But was that the only thing worth mentioning that happened in Singapore after 1965? Dr. Tam was clearly trying to delegitimize Singapore's post-1965 achievements. This is a political move. Our High Commissioner and I thought that Dr. Tam's unbalanced interpretation of modern Singapore could not go unchallenged and discussed which of us should do so. In the event, neither of us needed to reply, because a member of the audience, a Cambridge Don, if I remember correctly, or any rate a Caucasian gentleman, completely punctured Dr. Tam by asking him what was it that he wanted to speak about that Mr. Lee had prevented. Dr. Tam was clearly discombobulated by the question and gave no coherent answer. After the spectacle he made of himself, anything the High Commissioner or I could have said was redundant. Now, this was in itself a trivial incident if that was all. And if that was all, it would not be worth recounting. But Dr. Tam's effort to delegitimize the post-1965 Singapore story went well beyond that one episode. 3 years after the Cambridge Conference in August 2018, Dr. Tam, together with a group of Singapore activists, called on Dr. Mahathir in Malaysia to ask him to help bring democracy to Singapore. The implication obviously was that democracy, as he conceived the term, existed in Malaysia but not in Singapore. Dr. Tam even went so far as to suggest that Malaysia Day, the day that commemorates the formation of Malaysia, be celebrated as Singapore's, and I quote him, unofficial Independence Day. Can you imagine that? Malaysia Day should be Singapore's unofficial Independence Day. Now, if that is not a politically motivated attempt to rewrite history, to delegitimize the post-1965 Singapore story, I don't know what to call it. Singapore's special circumstances, our size, our openness, and short existence as a sovereign state, makes us vulnerable to the manipulations of history and identity. I'll give you another example. Some have tried to use Singapore's past as one of several port cities in the Malay Muslim world to support their contention that our Malay Muslim community has been marginalized post-1965. And it is my impression that attempts to use history as a political weapon have become more frequent in recent years, and not just with regard to our Malay Muslim community. I also mentioned China in my second lecture, but that does not exhaust the list. Core aspects of the idea of Singapore are being assailed, internally and externally, from several directions, including the West. Singaporeans should be alert to the fact that not all users of history are innocent. Earlier this year, I agreed to contribute an essay to Senior Minister Lee Hsien Loong's foreign policy achievements, essay on Senior Minister Lee Hsien Loong's foreign policy achievements, to a book on his tenure as Prime Minister. The book is still being compiled and has not been published yet. In preparation, I conducted an experiment. I asked a wide selection of Singaporean friends, all interested in and knowledgeable about foreign policy, not all from the government, from a wide spectrum of Singapore society. I asked them what they thought were Lee Hsien Loong's greatest foreign policy achievements. It's kind of a rough survey of opinion. Totally unscientific, I just want to get an impression. The answers were, as you might expect, no surprises. Not surprisingly, successfully navigating the increasingly complex US-China relationship, maintaining stable relations with our often difficult neighborhood, and keeping Singapore respected and relevant internationally were the most common answers. All absolutely correct, but in my mind, all questions were very easy. In the last decade or so of Mr. Lee's tenure as Prime Minister, the Constitution was amended to allow for the reserve presidency. That was in 2016. The Singapore Chinese Cultural Centre was opened. That was the next year, 2017. And the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, commonly known as POFMA, in 2019, and the Foreign Interference Countermeasures Act, FICA, 2021, were passed. Initiated during then PM Lee's tenure was the Maintenance of Racial Harmony Bill, 2025. Now, although all the initiatives I just listed are generally regarded as domestic, they deal one way or another with the foreign policy issues that lie at the heart of the unique challenges confronting the Singapore identity. For many years to come, in one way or another, how we understand our history and hence how we define our identity and our core national interests will confront every Singapore government with potentially existential questions about Singapore's long-term survival in its current form. I emphasize, in its current form. I mean, Singapore as an island, as a city, is not going to disappear. But we may not manage ourselves the same way as we manage ourselves today. It may be managed in a different form. In my second lecture, I told you that this horizontal idea of managing ourselves as a multiracial society is in fact the anomaly in our region. Every other country, actually it's not just a immediate region, from Northeast Asia down through the Middle East, organizes itself on basis of hierarchy, either ethnic hierarchy or religious hierarchy, or sometimes both. So this is a very important issue. I think it's an existential question for Singapore remaining as it is. Identity is the ground where domestic and foreign policies intersect and potentially collide. I'm hard-pressed to think of any policy domain that does not, in some form and degree, engage this issue. If we can successfully manage this issue, then external complexities can be navigated. I'm quite confident of that. If we fail to manage this central issue, the complexities of external issues will be accentuated and may well become unmanageable. That the relatively knowledgeable group I consulted did not think beyond the conventional distinction between foreign and domestic policies was a little disappointing. For reasons previously mentioned, it's difficult for the government to speak as clearly in public about this crucial issue as he would probably like to speak. Although as Prime Minister, Mr. Lee had delicately alluded to it on several occasions, including in his Chinese language National Day rally speeches. But I wonder how many Singaporeans really understood his point. Well, I'm going to make this lecture rather short because it's the last lecture. I want to leave as much time as possible for questions. But in my first lecture, some of you may recall that I made an allusion to Venice as another city-state, and I promised to say a few words about Venice and its relevance to Singapore. So let me conclude with that. Historically, small city-states have generally not survived for very long. The exception was the Venetian Republic. Venice existed for over a millennium, between the 7th century and the 18th century. But it too eventually declined and failed as an independent sovereign state. The reasons for Venice's failure are complex. But C.P. Snow, a British civil servant, physicist, and novelist, summarized the essential reason best in his 1959 Reed lecture at Cambridge University entitled The Two Cultures. Snow was discussing the problems of Britain in the mid-20th century and drew a parallel with Venice in its last half-century. What he said is worth quoting in full, so bear with me, and I'm quoting him now. Beginning of quote by C.P. Snow. Beginning quote. Like us, they once had been fabulously lucky. They had become rich, as we did, by accident. They had acquired immense political skill, just as we have. A good many of them were tough-minded, realistic, patriotic men. They knew, just as clearly as we know, that the current of history had begun to flow against them. Many of them gave their minds to working out ways to keep going. It would have meant breaking the pattern into which they had crystallized. They were fond of the pattern, just as we are fond of ours. They never found the will to break it. End of quote. Now, historical parallels are never exact. I certainly do not think that the current of history is flowing against Singapore. On the contrary, we are fortunate to be plugged into a region that for all its troubles is still growing. By 1959, Britain was an exhausted country. We are still vigorous. Sometimes a bit too vigorous and maybe in the wrong directions, but never mind. Vigor is vigor. Unlike Britain in 1959, we have no nostalgia for past glories, imagined or real. Our leaders, although perhaps not every single office holder, every single civil servant, or every single Singaporean, is certainly aware of the need to break the pattern while holding firm on fundamentals. Nothing is predetermined, and there's no reason why Singapore must fail. The vulnerabilities of a still malleable identity and those arising from the erosion of the tough-mindedness needed to distinguish between the theology of foreign policy and practical diplomacy are not yet irretrievable, provided they are squarely recognized and public support is mobilized. There are nevertheless lessons to be drawn from Snow's analysis of Venice's failure. What Snow reminds us is that failure need not be the consequence of some catastrophic event, some spectacular disaster or drastic mistake. Failure could well be, and perhaps more often is, the result of inertia or complacency. As I mentioned in an earlier lecture, failure could be the result of the gradual, almost imperceptible aggregation of small, individually insignificant decisions not taken, decisions postponed, or decisions avoided. As a reminder of that immediate danger, it seems appropriate to end this last lecture by quoting two stanzas from W.H. Auden's poem, The Fall of Rome. Caesar's double bed is warm. As an unimportant clerk writes, I do not like my work on a pink official form. Altogether elsewhere, vast herds of reindeer move across miles and miles of golden moss, silently and very fast. On that note, I shall end. Thank you for listening to me so patiently. I'll be happy to take your questions now.
All right. So thank you very much. Thank you for your excellent speech, and also I kind of was expecting that you are going to talk about more the foreign policy challenges or the international challenges that Singapore faces internationally. But then I think. You actually go in deep about the Singapore's kind of identity and core interests that Singapore needs to actually think through repeatedly, and then everything is still working in progress, and then that kind of progress or process is really important to define Singapore's core interests now and then probably in the future too. And so I was really fascinated about the idea of your kind of the importance of the education and the national education in Singapore, and then I really quickly ask one question about the role of the university, because we are actually teaching at the university, and then all the kind of students in the universities here, and then what kind, if you could actually change one thing in the university, what kind of the things we need to teach at the university level, and then how does it actually contribute to the reframing the Singapore story, or the efforts to reframe the Singapore story?
That's a very good question. I think all our universities, in fact, I think all universities throughout the world have failed miserably in one of their basic functions, because it's public education. It is to frame debates so that publics have a deeper understanding of core issues. This is not peculiar to Singapore. It is a function of how academia has evolved, even in my lifetime. Some of you may or may not know, once upon a time I had some idea of becoming an academic, and I was pursuing a PhD. Halfway through my dissertation, I decided that it was not worth the time because I didn't want to be a teacher. But I think, so I'm not totally without understanding, but the way academics were prepared for an academic career, and that was in the late 70s, is become very different these days. Academics throughout the world, this is not something peculiar to Singapore, are forced by the imperatives of the system as it has evolved to study narrower and narrower slices of things that I sometimes wonder whether or not they are themselves very interested in. I'm talking about the humanities and social sciences. The STEM subjects are, of course, quite different. But you see, the STEM subjects, science per se, builds on the accumulation of knowledge, step by step, small steps, right? I don't think humanities or social science are like that. In fact, I always think that social science is a bit of an oxymoron for reasons that I mentioned in my second lecture. The difference between complicated problems and complex problems. Right? But anyway, that's a separate thing. But I don't blame academics, by the way. I was just in my own university, in Columbia University. I gave a lecture there, and I was just talking to some people, including one or two people, one survivor of my dissertations about supervisor. And he was about to retire. And in fact, he had already retired, right? He's professor emeritus now, right? But they couldn't replace him. No. Why? He was a Japan specialist, by the way.
Oh, the
he was a Japan specialist.
Yeah.
I had two, James Morley and Jerry Curtis.
Yeah.
James Morley was the primary one. He's passed away. Now, both of them held a particular chair in Columbia University, which was basically about East Asian international relations. But although both were Japan specialists, they had a broad view. They were trained to have a very broad view of things, right? But they couldn't. It's only, I met Professor Curtis just last month in Tokyo, and he said they only after about 7 or 8 years of search found a person who the university was comfortable with, and the person itself was comfortable with teaching broadly, because they're not trained that way. Beyond that, the kind of public discourse that universities were actually set up to do historically, you get no credit for it. So if you write an article for a newspaper, the university is not going to count it for your tenure, it's not going to count it for your promotion, right? In fact, it's probably going to be held against you in some universities, right? And it's not just here, in Singapore, it's throughout the world. So that means to me that the universities everywhere have failed essentially in one of the essential functions of the idea of a university. And all universities have to play this game. I once looked up, I read an article. The average refereed article has a readership of about 7 people. Right? And probably 2 of them as your mother and your father, and they only pretended to read it. Right? So, the public education part of the university has failed. Secondly, when you are talking about international relations and social science in general, you are studying narrower and narrower and narrower things. And you must do it. I'm not blaming the academics, because this is the imperatives of the system. Right? The kind of broad thought that universities should be promoting is just not there anymore in the public discourse. Right. So I think you can do that, but you will have, I don't think you are incapable of have this broad view. I'm sure you can, but you will sacrifice your career if you do that. And I'm not asking you to do that.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. I think that's also the academics kind of debating about it, and then because the academics sometimes go into really silo, and then also technical issues, which is sometimes important for their academic career, and also the issues too. But then at the same time, as you said, I think the interdisciplinary kind of perspective is important, and which is not necessarily kind of evaluated properly, like in the university too. So in that sense, there's always kind of struggles, and then right now, like I completely understand, like in the United States also, their kind of academic perspective is going more on that kind of technical side, which actually sometimes lose their interdisciplinary perspective as well. So that's always the kind of struggle, and then, but like I guess the liberal arts kind of like the perspective to incorporate many other kind of discipline to understand like what's going on, and then what the world is like, and then like constantly thinking about it is a really, really important issue, I guess too. But like, thank you very much for your.
I'll just take an example.
Sure.
Supposing I was a young lecturer in NTU or NUS or SMU, any university, and I was hired to teach Singapore foreign policy. If I gave those 3 lectures, I would not get promoted even to assistant professor. But none of them are political science.
But students will love it, probably.
Students may like it, but the university will hate it.
So there are particular kind of like the evaluation standard that like you need to follow, like in many places. Like not like in.
So I really don't have a solution to you, because it's beyond my power to remake the entire world academic system as I think it ought to be.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. So I think like we constantly have to struggle for this kind of like the issues too. All right, I get I think like there should be the questions from the floor. So I open to the floor, and then if you have any questions, please raise your hand so I can point it out. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Fahima, PhD student at RSIS.
PhD in what?
Indonesia's foreign policy on Israel.
Okay, just as long as you don't take PhDs in international relations seriously, it does you no lasting harm.
I shall take advice
I'm a living proof of that.
I shall take advice on reading the events more than the theory. You spoke about the reframing of the narrative. I'm just curious, is it really about a translation? Because how much of our narratives, which is really about vulnerability, multiracial pragmatism, or state-led resilience, how much of translation and reframing can we do? That's one question. Second is, do you think, it's also a question of even the public service now is of new generation. So do we have the capabilities to reframe and educate the way you are envisioning? Do we have the people for it? I don't want to directly say that there could be a lack of competence, but what does it take then to do this reframing when even civil service is now being run by the new generation?
I don't think it's lack of competence. I think it's a bit more complicated problem, right? I think there are two problems. One is the idea of vulnerability needs to be itself reframed. Connected to the old, the old vulnerabilities that arose from lack of military capability, very weak economy, and so on, those are obviously past. We're not going to be vulnerable that way. Nobody in Malaysia or even Indonesia is going to try to invade us and so on, because they know that they can't, right? But that doesn't. So you have to redefine vulnerability as maybe the vulnerabilities of success. But one of the same core is because of the youth of 60 years old is quite a ripe old age for a human being. But for a country, it's not even infancy, okay, right? And that means your values are malleable, and that's a different kind of vulnerability, particularly when you are in an age of identity politics globally, right? So you will have to do one thing, reframe that thing, and you have to connect it to the old vulnerabilities as a certain historical narrative. That's doable. And I don't think it's a lack of competence. Quite some time ago, actually, when was it? I think it was around 2016 or thereabouts. I gave the S.R. Nathan lectures, IPS S.R. Nathan lectures. And I devoted almost the whole of the last lecture to expanded and much more pointed extended complaint about national education and how history was not taught. And the Ministry of Education asked me to go and talk to the curriculum setters, and I did. Right? I did. And I found that the people who were trying to set the history curriculum had three problems. One you mentioned, because not everybody who is going to be teaching history has the background, the right background. Because I was horrified at that time. I found out that at least at NUS, you could graduate with an honors degree in history without studying anything about our own region. It's possible. You could study all about the French Revolution if that was your interest, or the history of cinema or something. And you could have a first-class honors degree in history, but not one thing about Southeast Asia or Singapore or even East Asia or Asia. But anyway, these people doing the history curriculum understood the problem. They were trying to revise it, but they faced this problem. That problem also can be overcome because you can put it into the NIE curriculum, right? If not the main National Institute of Education, right? But the bigger problem was this. If you are going to devote more time to teaching the history of Singapore, which I think you ought to, that means you're going to have to devote less time to teaching something else, right? And it's very hard to have a balance. And I can sympathize with that because I have two sisters, both of them are teachers. And they tell me they love teaching, but they hate the parents. Right? Because they are caught in a dilemma. If you pack the curriculum, the parents come and grumble at you that my child is stressed out of their mind, why are you destroying my child's mental and physical health. If they try to make the curriculum a little bit easier, broader, more creative, you're not teaching my child properly, he's going to fail O-levels or PSLE or something. So our curriculum is already very packed. If we include more of this, I think they call it civic studies or something now, right? There's going to be less of something else. That is just it. So it's very hard to find that balance. So I don't think it's lack of competency. Where you have, in the civil service proper, this I'm talking about going beyond the schools now, or beyond the university. In the civil service proper, I think, you know, much of the national education comes in through the civil service college. And then it mainly is focused on the basic programs that civil servants have to go through. When you first join, when you get to mid-career, mid-level, and then senior level. The basic focus is at what you call the SMP, Senior Management Program, about people about to reach around director, DG level, and leaders in public administration, you being considered for Deputy Secretary, PERMSET. There, I think the thing is pretty well done, right? But the irony is this, you see. If you get to the point where you are attending SMP or LAP, you should know all these things already. You know, you have no business being advanced in your career to that point, right? But they do a pretty good job because they don't do it themselves. They get ministers, they get senior civil servants, they get senior ex-civil servants like me to go and do it, right? But I just did one for LAP course last week. But then I went and told them, look, you know, it's pointless for me to give you a lecture if you don't already know what I'm about to tell you. You don't deserve to be here. So let's have a discussion instead. Let's just have a discussion. So I don't think the civil service problem. But the problem is they are taught all these things at the more junior level when they first join. They are given enough. But when they start their work, they lose sight of it. Because I see one of the themes that has run through these 3 lectures is that this division between foreign policy and domestic policy is a totally artificial one, right? Okay. They know this, all these people know this, but when they get to their work, it slips out of their mind. That's why I say there's a very insidious danger that you take decisions that not intending but anything harmful, but the accumulation of decisions ends up with a result that, you know, erodes your core values. And sometimes things are done too hastily. Look, you're doing a PhD or something that you said about Middle East, right?
Indonesia's foreign policy on Israel.
Okay, I'll give you an example that is not on that thing, but, you know, I think some of you probably remember, was it last year or year before last, there was this fiasco when the Ministry of Education put out all these talking points on the thing, right? So I heard about it, I made a big fuss, they sent me all their talking points, and I said all these talking points are ridiculous because they had different sets of talking points, right? It is not possible for you at primary school, secondary school, even junior college to even convey a flavor of the complexity of this Palestinian issue. And who's going to do the teaching? People who themselves don't know anything, right? So I said, all you can really do, and the talking points were bad. I think they have been more or less discarded, and I hope I had some influence on that and modified. I said, all you can do is tell people this. This is an extremely complicated issue, right? And it is a very emotive issue. You can have your own view on this issue. We are not going to tell you what you should think about this issue, but we can tell you these are Singapore's interests, which are neither Palestinian interests nor Israeli interests, right? So that's all you can do. You try to educate people in the whole history of the Palestinian issue in the course of one lecture actually. You're going to fail, you're going to mess it up, and they did mess it up. Further, you know, when as teaching aids, the teachers have their own pack of slides. So I was trying to count how many times in the teacher's pack of slides, they told the teacher, this is very sensitive, very sensitive, very sensitive, very sensitive. The result of it is the teachers panic, right? Because they don't know much about the issue, and they know it's sensitive, they're not stupid, and then you scare them to do. So the whole thing was a mess, right? But that one, messes happen in our civil service too. Fortunately, not of that scale and not too often, but they do happen because they are trying to do things too fast. After that, I told them I had more or less left the Middle East Institute already. I told them, let us do a course for your people who are going to teach these civics lessons. We can't tell you everything about the Middle East, but we can tell you a little bit about the Middle East. So at least when one of your kids asks you a question, you at least know where to find the answer. I'm not expecting you to become big. So, you are right and you are not right. I think it's not a matter of competency, although sometimes this one was, it's not really lack of competency, it was a bit of panic by the ministry to try to deal with the problem without thinking through how to deal with it properly. Right.
All right, thank you very much. All right, any other questions? Wants to talk about the domestic issues in policy, international relations, anything? One? All right, I actually have the several questions on my list, so the maybe. Oh yeah. Anyone? Oh yeah, the person, like gentleman over there.
Hi, Mr. Carlson. I'm Jun from NUS. I'm doing a master's in international relations. My question is on Timor-Leste. It's recently admission into ASEAN. So you previously mentioned that admitting Timor-Leste into ASEAN would prove a mistake. So I was wondering, maybe in the following three domains, ASEAN's economic integration, managing great power geopolitics, or managing intra-ASEAN relations, in which domain might ASEAN feel this mistake the most keenly and why?
All three. I tell you what, I don't know whether you saw the news yesterday, I think. There were protests by young Timor-Lesteans against parliamentarians being given new cars or something like that. Now this new car, the proximate issue is not important. What it reveals there is a great divide between the political elite, which is rather small, and they have not really refreshed the political elite despite 25 years of independence, and the general population. Timor-Leste is a state that is teetering on the brink of state failure. If you look at all its social, economic, cultural matrices, most of them are much closer to sub-Saharan Africa than almost any Southeast Asian country, except maybe Myanmar, because Myanmar is in the middle of a civil war, so that's not a very good baseline comparison. And it might fail. Why do we want to take a state? If it fails, the rest of the world will say it is your problem. They will deal with it, and we are not going to be able to deal with it. Secondly, it is increasingly dependent on Chinese state, Chinese investment, Chinese state. So it's going to be another Laos. This present leadership, where they have their own liabilities, I don't think this is among them. But they can't, Ramos Sarkar, Gusmao can't do forever. So I think they are not really in any of the three areas, except maybe the culture. Because nobody in ASEAN really knows what the culture is about. So if they do anything you want, right? But in political, strategic, economic, they are ready. They don't have the capability. The ASEAN department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Timor-Leste is quite okay. Not at a very high level, but at least basic competency is there. But it's very small, and ASEAN requires a whole of government approach if you are really going to take it seriously. And they don't have that capability. I'll give you many years ago when I was still contact, my counterpart, Timor-Leste counterpart, came to see me, and he's a very smart guy. He spent almost his entire life and career in Macau as a Portuguese also. So he spoke Portuguese, of course, he spoke English, he spoke Mandarin, he spoke Cantonese. And he's a very smart guy. But he told me, that he has to use interpreters to communicate with his foreign ministry, the head of the department. Because many of them were like him, they were exiled people from Timor-Leste who came back to help with idealists in an idealistic way. But they had no common language that all could understand. So in his own internal meetings, he had to use interpreters. Now this situation has not much improved across the Timorese government. You have got a small elite, and by the way, many of that elite who came in the first idealism 25 years ago, they got fed up and they're dead. Because they can't get things done. Right? And you got a population that's still rather uneducated, very tribal still, right? It's just a mess waiting to happen. But why did we want to take it in? Because we just decided to be nice, and that's not about foreign policy. That's being sentimental, rather than that's mistaking the theology of foreign policy for practical diplomacy. I think it's going to be a strategic mistake. It's going to prove to be a strategic mistake. But it's too late, so there's no point worrying about it. We'll just have to deal with it when it happens. We just hope it doesn't blow up too badly in our faces. That it will blow up, I have no doubt.
All right. Thank you. So any other questions? Someone up there. Yeah, over there.
Hello, good afternoon, sir. My name is Li Heng. I work in a Russian company. So let me try to frame this question in the context of what you just shared.
Which company?
Kaspersky. It's a Kaspersky. It's a cybersecurity company.
Okay, yeah.
So 3 years ago, Singapore made a very principled stance about the Ukraine war. And I think it was a quite rare instance of making such pronouncements.
Yeah.
People around me are saying, why are we so ambiguous about Israel and Palestine? So you don't see an equally principled stance. And I think it can be explained by national interest, because you want that world order where big countries can't just go into a small country, and that can be explained. But it's also that theology that you're talking about. So if we're going to go into more pragmatic diplomacy, how do we frame it correctly for public consumption such that they understand why is it sometimes we talk, sometimes we don't talk?
Well, I think you have a good question, right? And you have got the right answer. And I can even make it more complicated for you. First of all, Russia, Ukraine, the primary consideration was the principle, right? And the cost is minimal for standing up to that principle. Because our relationship with Russia is not bad, by the way, but it's not good. And despite our position, it's still not bad. We don't take the same position as as, for example, the Europeans. We don't shun the Russians. We still deal with them. We have bilateral dialogue with them and so on. For Israel, Palestine, we take a principled position at a theological level. I spoke about it in my first lecture. I don't know whether you hear it or not, right? But I can also make it more complicated. We supported US when they invaded Iraq. So the consistency of our policy, of our foreign policy, is one of interest, not necessarily principle. Right? We are very consistent in following our interests. But our interests take us in different directions and lead to different actions. Now this is it's not impossible to explain. I've always thought that it's not good to start talking too much about our principal foreign policy, because the fact is we have not been very consistent at the level of principle, but we have been extremely consistent at the level of interest. It's always our interest, right? I've always thought that it is a complete mistake for us to say too many times. I mean, once or twice is fine. that, you know, a world run by international law, international organization is good for small countries. Now that's like saying water is wet, you know, it's true, but you know, so what, right? Okay? But the real question is this such a world? It's not such a world. International law, international organization, regional organization, like ASEAN, you know, and the use of force. These are all instruments of foreign policy. And you have to choose the right instrument for the right issue. We are not going, I mean, the former chief of Malaysian Armed Forces is on public record saying that Lee Kuan Yew told him that if PAS takes power in Malaysia and starts interfering with the water, we are not going to wait for the Security Council to solve this issue. This is what the SAF is for. So it's not that we shouldn't say that we are, yes, these things are, we prefer not to do it this way, but we need to have the whole range of instruments. And we need to be able to explain this. But as I said, it's very difficult for a government, any government, to explain this in public, right? I always, when I use this episode, I always quote the head of the Malaysian Armed Forces. It's not me saying it, it's just me quoting him saying it. Right? I'm not even saying whether it's true or not, but he said it. Right? So it's very difficult to explain these things, but these things need to be understood. The fact that they are not understood is what I call foreign policy illiteracy. And I think it is a vulnerability for a country like Singapore, because foreign policies need public support. And if your public thinks that foreign policy is all about the UN and international law and milk and honey, then we are in trouble. Now, I don't think our public is that stupid, but there is a very large streak of that, because there are people, ex-diplomats, not me, obviously, and, you know, foreign minister, serving officers, they have to be able to sprout their theology. And I do sprout the theology myself, even though I'm retired, depending on the audience. But this kind of audience, is no point me coming here and talking about theology or foreign policy to you. Because you might as well, then I might as well don't come, I'm wasting your time and mine, right? So it's difficult to explain, but I think we need to explain it better. But we need to, but the very fact of explaining is a political act, right? And it has to be done. I can explain, right? Even some of my colleagues do explain as best they can, given the limitations if they are still serving. But it has to be explained at the political level. Actually, as I mentioned just now, if you've been following Lee Hsien Loong's National Day rally speeches, especially the Mandarin language ones, he has been explaining influence operations, but he has had to do it so delicately that I wonder often, I know it misses most of the audience. Right? But this is life. This is what political leadership is about. I think that's why I say national education is extremely important, right? But we don't do it very well. The best national education is the best.
Right, great, thank you. Others, are there any other additional questions? Oh, yeah. No, nothing.
Good afternoon, Mr. Kosikan. I'm Zheng Shiwei. I'm a master student from RSI School. So my question is, as you mentioned that the core idea of Singapore's national identity is we want to be an international bridge which connect the area and the international.
You say that at all.
You just mentioned as a very important idea for constructing Singapore's identity is international trade.
That's a tension. That's a tension. It's not the core idea.
Okay. It's a part of it, right?
A very minor part, but I think you missed the point. But now I'll explain the point again.
So my question is, we are actually facing more and more international national conflicts, right, such as the China and India or China and the United States. So I want to know is, do you agree that will be probably as a challenge for the future Singapore's national identity construction? If so, do you have any suggestion for the Singapore's government? Thank you.
Okay, the core idea of which Singapore is based, arising from our history, is that although the majority of Singaporeans are of Chinese ethnicity, and the majority of Singaporeans speak English as a lingua franca rather than any of our own languages. We are based we organize ourselves as a multiracial society. And that sets up certain tensions. Now, my main point of the 3 lectures is that this is a domestic issue, but it's also the core foreign policy issue. If you can manage this, you can manage the external issues. And the reason for that, if you know who you are, you can define your interests clearly, in your own terms, and not because, not in terms of Chinese interests or Indian interests or American interests or any other country's interests. And that is almost the whole of the theory of Singapore foreign policy. Right? Now, the practice of it can be very difficult, but it's not impossible. We have done it for 60 years. Right? And I don't see why we cannot do it for another 60 years, provided we can manage the internal tensions. The tensions are twofold. One is you are a multiracial society, which is a horizontal organizing concept. In a region, in a world actually, of identity politics, which asserts countries should be organized on the basis of hierarchy, either ethnic hierarchy or religious hierarchy or some kind of imagined hierarchy. There's one tension that needs to be managed. The other tension is that you need to build a nation around this principle. But at the same time, you need to keep yourself open to the world. You need to be both local and cosmopolitan. To make a living, that's where I think you misunderstood me. Because you cannot say that multiracialism is a superior way of life if it makes you poor. Nobody will believe you. Right? You have to show that this is a way of life that makes us rich. And that cannot be done only by multiracialism, but by keeping yourself plugged into the global economy, which therefore exposes you to all kinds of identity issues. So it is a constant balancing act, but it's not impossible. That's what they used to pay me for 37 years to do. Have I answered your question? There's no model answer, But you keep these principles in mind, then you have to apply them to particular situations as they arise. Right?
Great. Thank you so much. So yeah, identity is a really important issue, and then also like it reminds me of the Japan's case too. Like Japan is always trying to constantly think about its own identity, and then they get lost sometimes. But then that's a really important issue. Identity as often this almost always defines your interest. So in order to understand your identity, you have to think through over time. Any other? Oh yes, sorry.
Marcus from RSS. Just to add on the question, because you mentioned about multiculturalism. So because you mentioned multiculturalism and meritocracy that defines Singapore's foreign policy. You briefly mentioned things like the British legacy. So
sorry, I missed that last one.
The sort of the British legacy that you mentioned, the colonial roots and stuff. So also you mentioned that sets Singapore apart from the rest of Southeast Asia. So can you explain a bit more on the?
Not really that. Look, my point is this. The most relevant part of our political history is actually a rather short one. It is post-1965, but post-1965 is based on post-1890, when British colonialism started. But we now know, because of a lot of historical studies, and including archaeological studies, that the history goes back much, at least to the 14th century. And from the 14th century to now, you have been performing more or less similar functions at different technological levels, at different levels of sophistication, as a trading center, as a logistics center, and so on, from the time of the market. But you also know you have disappeared and then you came back, right? So the challenge really, you can't really deny the pre-colonial past, right? But that pre-colonial past puts you directly in the Malay world, and you are an anomaly. On the other hand, because you are small, you can't take your relevance for granted. You have to create relevance as an artifact. And to create relevance, you must be an anomaly. Because if you are just like any other country around you, why the hell does anybody want to deal with you? So this is another balancing act you have to manage, right? It's not quite the same as what you were referring to. You're referring to Nihon Jinron, right?
Yeah, I mean, since the year, I don't know, like 18th, 19th century.
That is a different issue. We can talk about it.
Okay, sure, yeah, different issue.
But it is, okay, you can't deny that you are in the middle of Southeast Asia, and you're in the middle of the Malay Muslim part of Southeast Asia. This is your immediate environment. But you can't deny that 3/4 of the population is of Chinese ethnicity, and they are not particularly a welcome minority in the Malay Muslim part of Southeast Asia, historically and today. How do you manage it? That's one tension, right? Now, the fact that you now know that your history did not begin in 1890 or 1965 has to be incorporated in your national story. You can't deny it. But you must not incorporate it in a way that allows the argument to be made. Then you're just like any other country. Because we cannot be just like any other country around us. Not merely on the basis of ethnicity, but on the basis of how we organize ourselves. Right? And in a way, this is managing this tension is the whole of managing relations with our immediate neighbors. They will prefer us to behave, because despite what we say is a multiracial society and so on, they look at you as a Chinese country because of the majority population. And they would prefer you to behave as their own Chinese populations behave. In other words, in a subordinate way. And that, of course, we don't accept. Right? So at the same time, we don't want to be quarreling with them every other day. Right? So how do we manage that? So there are these inherent tensions among the others I mentioned, between nation building and being global, between part of the region and not part of the region. This is the essence of Singapore's foreign policy, but it boils down to actually a domestic politics of Singapore. How do you manage that? You can manage that, you can manage this other thing. You can't manage that, you can't manage this other thing. And that is where I feel our national education has not sufficiently exposed these. Our national education is a rather simplistic narrative. Right? And it has to be simple because you are teaching it en masse, you can't, you are teaching at different levels, right? I can't be talking like this to a primary school kid. They won't listen to me for more than 2 minutes. Okay. So this is a challenge of what we need to do.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. So unfortunately, the time has come, so that we kind of have to close today's session, and then I'll pass my mic to Dylan, and then he is going to wrap up.
Thank you all for coming. It leaves us with just one last task of thanking Mr. Kausikan for the generous sharing across 3 sessions. Please, let's thank you. Before we end this, the program has a appreciation event to Mr. Kausikan.
Oh, it's a book.
Yeah, this is very
That's all right.
So, yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
To join me in thanking Mr. Kausikan.
Thank you.